The lock on the east door failed at 14 minutes past 2 in the morning, and I was already awake before the sound finished. 11 years in the Seoul Defense Corps does that to a person. You never really sleep again, not fully. Some part of you stays on watch, listening for the wrong kind of silence. That night, the silence was wrong. The hum of the perimeter sensors had stopped. The soft click of the servo lock, the one that was supposed to be unbreakable, had turned into a dull scrape of metal against metal. I set down the tray I had been carrying toward the kitchen and stepped into the hallway. My name is Marcus Webb. For 4 years I have served as butler to Her Majesty Kothess Velinor, sovereign of the Thren Dominion, currently residing on Earth as head of her people's diplomatic mission. To the agency that placed me here, I was simply a well-mannered man with good references and steady hands. Nobody asked what I did before I learned how to fold a ceremonial sash or pour tea without spilling a drop. Nobody thought to ask, because nobody imagined that a queen from another star would ever need a soldier standing quietly behind her chair. That night, I was glad nobody had asked. The residence was a converted manor on the edge of the city. Tall windows, long corridors, more rooms than any one person could ever need. The Queen's private wing sat at the far end of the East Hall, past 3 checkpoints that were supposed to be watched around the clock. I counted the seconds as I moved. 4 minutes had already passed since the sensors died. That was enough time for someone patient to get very far into a building this size. I heard boots on marble, careful and quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes from training. 6 sets, moving in pairs. Someone had studied this house. Someone had studied the patrol schedule, the shift changes, even the hour when the kitchen staff usually went home. This was not a random break-in. This was a plan, built over weeks, maybe months. I stayed in the shadow of a support column and watched the first pair pass. Dark clothing, no insignia, weapons held low and steady. Kinetic dampeners fitted to their boots, which was how they had crossed the marble floor without a single echo. Professionals. Mercenaries, most likely, hired by one of the rival factions who wanted the Thren throne destabilized. A queen taken alive was worth far more than a queen left in peace. That was the calculation someone had made, somewhere, in a room I would never see. I did not have a weapon. I never carried one inside the residence, because the queen did not like the sight of them, and because I had promised her, when she hired me, that violence was a chapter of my life that had closed. I had believed that when I said it. That night I understood that some chapters do not close, they simply wait. I moved along the wall, staying low, until I was close enough to hear one of the intruders speak into a small comm unit fixed to his collar. His voice was flat and businesslike, the voice of someone who had done this kind of work before and expected to do it again. Team 2, hold position at the east stair. Team 1, proceed to the private wing. Package is confirmed inside. No guards reported on this level. No guards reported on this level. That told me something useful. The Queen's own security detail, 3 trained officers who normally covered the ground floor at night, had either been drawn away or dealt with before I ever woke. That was troubling, but it also meant nobody else in this house knew what was happening except me. I thought of Kothess sleeping 2 floors up, unaware, and something in my chest went very still and very calm. That calm was familiar. It was the same calm that used to settle over me before a mission, the one my old commanding officer used to call the quiet before the work. I had not felt it in 4 years. I did not enjoy feeling it again, but I did not fight it either. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast, because the 2 men closest to me were already moving toward the private staircase. The manor had a service passage behind the east wall, narrow and dark, built for staff to move between floors without being seen by guests. I had used it 100 times to carry breakfast trays and folded linens. Tonight, I used it to get ahead of 6 armed strangers without them ever knowing I existed. I reached the 2nd floor landing before the intruders reached the base of the main stairs. From the shadow of the passage door, I watched them fan out, checking rooms one by one with the calm efficiency of people who had rehearsed this. They were good, I will give them that. But good is not the same as prepared, and they were not prepared for a house that had a 2nd set of hallways they did not know about, or a butler who had once cleared rooms exactly like these for a living. The Queen's chamber door stood at the end of the hall, carved wood, heavy and old, chosen more for beauty than for defense. 2 of the intruders were already approaching it. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached it. I stepped out of the passage and into the hallway, directly behind them. I did not shout. Shouting only tells the enemy where you are before you are ready for them to know. Instead, I simply said, in the same even tone I used every morning to announce breakfast, that the Queen was not currently receiving visitors. Both men turned at once, and for a fraction of a second, confusion crossed their faces. An older man in a black vest and pressed trousers was not what they expected to find standing between them and their target. That confusion cost them the only advantage they had left, which was surprise. What happened next took less than a minute, though it felt much longer while it was happening. I will not describe it in detail, because it is not a pleasant thing to describe, and because the details do not matter as much as the outcome. What matters is that 11 years of training does not disappear simply because you have spent 4 years pouring tea instead. The body remembers what the mind has tried to set aside. My hands remembered angles and distances and timing that I had promised myself I would never need again. I moved the way I had been taught to move, quickly, quietly, without wasted motion, and within a short span of time, both men in that hallway were no longer a threat to anyone. I heard footsteps below, the other 4 intruders reacting to the sudden silence from their teammates. I had only moments before they came looking. I crossed to the Queen's door and knocked twice, our old signal, the one she and I had agreed on years ago in case of fire or emergency drills that neither of us ever expected to actually use. Her voice came through, sleepy and confused, asking what was wrong. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that there were people in the house who should not be here, and that she needed to stay behind the door and let me handle it. There was a pause, and then her voice again, sharper now, fully awake, asking what exactly I meant by handle it. I did not have time to explain. I told her to trust me, the way she had trusted me with 1,000 smaller things over 4 years, and to keep the door locked until I told her otherwise. She agreed, though I could hear the disbelief in her voice, the same disbelief I imagine any employer would feel discovering their quiet, tea-pouring butler was suddenly standing guard in a hallway like a soldier. I turned back toward the stairs just as the remaining 4 intruders reached the top step. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with pale eyes and a scar above his brow, looked past me toward the 2 teammates lying still on the hallway floor, then back at me, and something like calculation crossed his face. He raised a hand, and the 3 behind him spread out, covering the width of the hallway so I could not simply slip past them. He asked, in a voice as flat as the one I had heard on the comm earlier, who exactly I thought I was. I told him the truth. I was the butler. He did not believe me, which was reasonable, given what he had just seen. He asked again, more forcefully this time, demanding to know who had trained me and who I worked for besides the woman sleeping behind that door. I told him I worked for her, and only her, and that was the only answer he was going to get. He gave a small nod to the man on his left, and I understood that reasoning with words was over. I will say only this about what followed. It was not easy. 4 trained operatives against 1 man who had spent the last 4 years mostly lifting tea trays and folding linens is not a fair fight on paper, and for a moment, it did not feel fair in practice either. There was a point, perhaps 90 seconds into it, when one of them managed to land a blow that sent me sideways into a display cabinet, cracking the glass and scattering porcelain across the floor. I remember the sharp ache in my shoulder and the thought, very clear and very calm, that I could not afford to stay down. I did not stay down. What carried me through those next few minutes was not strength, because by the end I did not have much strength left. It was training, deep and old and stubborn, the kind that does not ask permission from a tired body. It was also, if I am honest, the thought of Kathes standing on the other side of that door, waiting, trusting that the man who brought her morning tea would somehow also be the man who kept her safe. I did not want to disappoint that trust. One by one, the remaining intruders found themselves unable to continue. I will spare the details, again, because they are not the point of this story. The point is that when it was finally quiet, 4 more figures lay still in that hallway alongside the first 2, and I was standing, barely, breathing hard, one hand pressed against the cracked display cabinet to keep myself upright. I heard the door behind me open. Kathes stood in the doorway, wrapped in a dark robe, her 12 eyes wide and fixed on the scene in front of her. For a long moment neither of us said anything. She looked at the 6 still figures scattered across her hallway, then at the broken cabinet, then at me, and her mandibles clicked together in a way I had learned, over 4 years, meant she was too surprised to speak. I straightened my vest as best I could and told her, in the steadiest voice I could manage, that the situation was under control, and that I apologized for the mess. She did not laugh, not yet. She crossed the hallway slowly, stepping carefully around the fallen intruders, until she stood directly in front of me, studying my face the way she might study an unfamiliar document, searching for something she had missed. She asked me, quietly, who I really was. I told her the truth again, because it was the only thing I had to offer. I was a soldier once, a long time ago, before I ever learned to iron a shirt or arrange flowers. I had served 3 difficult tours far from home, and when it was over, I had wanted nothing more than a quiet life, a life where nobody depended on me to keep them alive. Butler work had given me that, or so I had believed, until tonight reminded me that some skills never really leave. She was quiet for a moment, processing this in the way I had come to recognize, her antennae twitching slightly as she thought. Then, finally she spoke, and her voice held something between disbelief and amusement. She said that in 400 years of life, across a dozen worlds and 100 palaces, she had never once employed a servant who turned out to be a soldier in disguise, and she found the idea almost too strange to believe. I told her I had never meant to deceive her. I had simply never expected the 2 halves of my life to meet again. Before she could answer, the sound of running footsteps echoed from the main staircase, and moments later, 3 uniformed figures burst into the hallway, weapons raised, eyes wide with alarm. It was her own security detail, finally awake and finally aware that something had gone terribly wrong under their watch. They stopped short at the sight of 6 intruders lying subdued across the floor, and then looked at me, disheveled, favoring one shoulder, standing beside their queen as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Their captain, a tall woman named Grace Whitfield who had served the Thren mission for 2 years, stared at me for a long moment before asking, very carefully, exactly what had occurred while they were unconscious in the security office. I explained as briefly as I could. Someone had disabled the exterior sensors and the interior comm relay, which had likely rendered the security office unresponsive rather than simply careless. The intruders had planned this carefully, choosing a night when they believed the house would be undefended. What they had not planned for was a butler with an unusual set of skills standing between them and their target. Grace looked at the 6 figures on the floor, then back at me, and something like respect crossed her expression, mixed with more than a little embarrassment that her own team had been outmaneuvered so completely. Kathes raised a hand before Grace could speak again, silencing the question forming on her lips. She said that explanations could wait until morning, that right now what mattered was securing the house, treating the wounds among the intruders humanely, as Thren law required even for enemies, and making certain that whoever had sent these people would learn very quickly that their plan had failed. Grace nodded and began issuing orders to her team, calling for restraints and for a secure transport to take the intruders into custody. Within a few minutes, the hallway that had been a battlefield only moments before was filled instead with the quiet, efficient movement of people doing their jobs, restoring order to a night that had nearly gone very differently. Kathes turned back to me once the immediate chaos had settled and asked if I was injured. I admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that my shoulder was likely bruised, perhaps worse, and that I would probably feel every bit of tonight's work in the morning. She insisted, in the firm tone she rarely used with me but always used with her own people, that I see the mission's medical officer immediately, and that this was not a request. I agreed, mostly because arguing with a queen at 3 in the morning did not seem like a wise use of what little energy I had left. As Grace's team led the subdued intruders away and began the long process of documenting the night's events, Kathes walked with me toward the medical wing, her pace slower than usual, matching mine. She was quiet for a while, and I assumed she was simply tired, until she finally spoke again. She asked how a man who had seen combat, who had clearly given years of his life to conflict, could then choose a profession built entirely around quiet, gentle service. She said she found it difficult to reconcile the two. I thought about the question longer than perhaps I needed to, because it was one I had asked myself many times over the years. I told her that after enough violence a person begins to crave its opposite. I had spent years learning how to end things quickly and efficiently, and when that chapter of my life closed, I wanted desperately to learn how to build something instead, even if that something was as small as a well-set table or a perfectly folded napkin. There was a kind of peace in service, in caring for someone else's comfort, that I had never found anywhere else. It did not erase what came before, but it gave me somewhere to put the years that followed. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when I finished, she said quietly that she understood more than I might expect. Her own position came with expectations of calm and grace at all times, regardless of what storms moved beneath the surface, and she had often wondered what it might feel like to simply set that weight down, even for a moment. She said that perhaps we were not so different after all, both of us carrying old burdens beneath ordinary-looking exteriors. We reached the medical wing, where a young officer named Daniel Whitcomb examined my shoulder and confirmed what I already suspected: a deep bruise and a mild strain, nothing that would not heal with rest and a few days of reduced activity. Kathes stood nearby throughout the examination, arms folded, watching with an expression I had never seen on her before, something between worry and quiet gratitude. When Daniel finished and stepped out to prepare a brace, Kathes finally allowed herself to laugh. That strange, layered, buzzing sound I had once found unsettling, and now found oddly comforting. She said that she had hired a butler 4 years ago, expecting someone who understood human customs well enough to guide her through Earth's confusing social rituals, and instead she had somehow ended up with a personal guardian who happened to also be excellent at pouring tea. I told her that I preferred to think of it as a package deal, and that most agencies simply failed to mention certain skills on a resume because nobody thought to ask. She said, still smiling in that strange insectoid way, that from this moment forward she intended to ask a great many more questions before hiring anyone else. As the sun began to rise over the manor grounds, casting pale gold light through the tall windows of the medical wing, Kathes sat beside me in comfortable silence, watching Grace's team finish their reports outside. She said after a while that she wanted to know everything about my years of service, not out of simple curiosity, but because she realized she had spent 4 years learning almost nothing true about the man who had quietly kept her comfortable and safe every single day. I told her it was a long story, filled with places and losses I did not often speak about, and that some of it was not easy to share. She said that she had time, more time than most humans could imagine, and that she would rather hear a difficult truth from a man she trusted than a comfortable silence that hid who he truly was. So I told her, not everything, not all at once, but enough. I spoke of the rim conflicts, of the friends I had lost and the ones I had managed to bring home, of the long nights that taught me patience and the shorter, sharper moments that taught me speed. I spoke of the discharge, the quiet apartment I returned to with no idea what to do with a life that no longer required me to be ready for anything, and the strange comfort I found in learning something as simple and human as how to properly set a formal table. Kathes listened to all of it without judgment, occasionally asking a question, occasionally simply nodding, until the sun had fully risen and the manor around us had returned, almost entirely, to its usual quiet rhythm. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, and then she said something I did not expect. She said that she believed the universe had a strange sense of timing, sending her a protector disguised as a servant exactly when she needed one most, though neither of us could have known it at the time. I told her that whatever the universe intended, I was simply glad I had been awake when the lock failed. She smiled again, and this time there was no strangeness in it at all, only warmth. And she said that starting today, she would sleep a little easier knowing exactly who stood outside her door each night. Daniel returned with the brace, and as he fitted it carefully around my shoulder, Kathes rose to leave, pausing at the doorway to look back at me one final time. She said that she still expected her tea at the usual hour that afternoon, brace or no brace, and that some traditions, even after a night like this one, were not meant to be broken. I told her it would be ready, exactly as always, and that some things, it seemed, never really change.